And as we hit 1:30 here on the East Coast, we welcome back all our attendees from across the United States and beyond to the Spectrum Conference, to our next session. And I am deeply excited for this session. I'm Joe Storch. I'm an associate counsel in the SUNY Office of General Counsel. I use he and him, and so glad to introduce our moderator, our convener of this session, and to have the panel get going. We have learned so much about the experiences of folks in the trans community. And at the same time, we have so much more to learn. And when I say we as a nation in the past couple of years. Yes, we have learned so much, but oh boy, do we have quite a bit more to learn, to have full understandings, to have better understandings, to act in a way that is the most welcoming and creates the best situation for folks, whether that's on our college campuses, in the medical environment, in the community at large, in K-12 and beyond. And we have an incredible panel with us today, but I don't get to introduce them. I get to introduce our convener. But before I do, because I get to help organize this conference, I want to take a moment of personal privilege just to specifically call out positively one of our speakers. We have great speakers, including folks who have spoken at the Spectrum Conference before. But we also have Dr. Kyan Lynch, and Kai was one of the people who was at the original table thinking about what would become the Spectrum Conference, coming up with ideas, scratching things down, sending emails day and night, working with Elizabeth and me and the team. And he is absolutely one of the core reasons that this conference got off the ground. So just as a point of personal privilege, I just wanted to say how excited I am. I think fourth Spectrum Conference where you are speaking. But let's get to our convener. We are so pleased always to work with our SUNY Press. SUNY is an academic institution. We have a very active press, and that press has some specializations, including in the experiences of LGBTQIA+ people. And so we are so pleased to welcome Dr. Rebecca Colesworthy, who is the acquisitions editor for SUNY Press, to kick off this incredible session, Writing Trans History, Who Speaks for Trans People. Rebecca?
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you, SUNY Spectrum, the organizers, everyone. It is a huge, tremendous honor to be convening this session. As Joe mentioned, I am the acquisitions editor of a number of areas at SUNY Press, including many that are highly germane to this particular conference, including queer studies, gender studies, education, Latinx studies. We have also been incredibly fortunate to publish works by past Spectrum keynotes, such as Jenny Beeman. And it was at SUNY Spectrum a few years ago that I was incredibly lucky to meet two of the now 4 co-editors of the fantastic volume that the speakers here today will be discussing. So as Joe mentioned, this session, Who Speaks for Trans People, stems in part from the fantastic work that the speakers have been doing in their role as co-editors of the forthcoming SUNY Press volume, From Margins to Mainstream, A History of Transgender Medicine in the United States. And I think what I'll do is first, well, before I forget, let me give you a discount code should you want to go shopping on the SUNY Press website later. Most importantly, that code, which I can actually put in the chat as well, is just SPEC 21. And so please do head to sunypress.edu and check out our titles. It's an honor to get to collaborate in this way. And I should say too that you should always feel free to reach out to me if you have further ideas about things that should be books that SUNY Press would like to publish, because I can guarantee you that they're seeing the mere numbers in the chat. There are lots of participants here with ideas, I'm sure. So our fabulous speakers today, Joe already mentioned Dr. Kyan Lynch, whose pronouns are he, him, his. Kai is OBGYN Department Education Specialist at the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Jamison Green, whose pronouns are he, him, his, is an author, a public speaker, the owner of Transgender Strategies Consulting, LLC, and a transgender policy advisor and subject matter expert. Dallas Denny, whose pronouns are she, her, hers, is a writer, editor, and speaker. And lastly, but not least, of course, Carolyn Wolf-Gould, whose pronouns are also she, her, hers, is a medical director at Susquehanna Family Practice and the Gender Wellness Center. I want to let them talk most of all, because that's who you're here to see. But I did just want to echo Joe's comments and stress how thrilled I am to be working with these four fabulous co-editors on this volume. Needless to say, but worth saying, it is a monumental and much needed undertaking. I am grateful to the co-editors and all of their contributors for undertaking the exceptional labor of making this volume happen, especially during these extraordinarily exceptional times. And since I don't always, get to see them, since I get to see them in the Zoom room, I feel compelled to stress here that, it's not lost on me, and it's really just hugely appreciated. And I'm grateful too to the many ways that they have helped me appreciate again and again and again that the issues, and most importantly, the people that they are helping to share their voices in a more public way and represent our mainstream, and that trans medicine is mainstream. And I'm just personally grateful. So thank you. I look forward to a wonderful, wonderful session.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Joe. Much love to both of you. And I could go on about how amazing Joe and Elizabeth are. I'm hoping you already know that, but they're wonderful people. So as Rebecca and Joe mentioned, my name is Kai. My pronouns are he, him, and I work at the University of Rochester Medical Center in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And I'm also a co-editor on this book that we've mentioned now, From Margins to Mainstream, A History of Trans Medicine in the United States, which is the only disclosure we have. Otherwise, we have no financial incentives to give this presentation. It's just out of love. And also important, I think, for just context for this session, I identify as a trans man, and that sort of comes through in everything that I do. I am the youngest of the co-editors here and also the most tech savvy, so I get to contribute in that way. Otherwise, these are like legends that I'm working with, so it's intimidating. So I take what I can get, and I'm going to be the techie during this presentation and moderate and try to keep my eye on the chat. But I would like to turn it over to my co-editors and co-presenters to tell us who they are. So I'd love to know from each of you, your name, pronouns, again, any professional identities that you want to share with us, and then what led you to want to co-edit a book about transgender history. So let's start with where the book started, and that's with Dr. Carolyn Wolf-Gould.
Well, thanks, Kyan. So I'm Carolyn Wolf-Gould. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a cisgender person, a physician, and I started the Gender Wellness Center in Oneonta, New York. For those of you who don't know, I think we're the biggest multidisciplinary center in upstate New York. We have a big program for a little town. I like to think of ourselves as the little engine that could, and people come from all over the state to our center, which continues to grow, and it's been a real privilege to serve in that capacity. So how did we come to this? So the Sage Encyclopedia person reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you like to write a piece for the Sage Encyclopedia?" And I said, sure. And she gave me a list of topics to pick, and I picked the history of transgender medicine. This was after taking care of many transgender patients in my practice, but I didn't really know anything about the history. And it was I think it was supposed to be a 5 or 7 page piece, and I just didn't know what I was getting into. But I started to read and learn about the history and the amazing pioneers, the amazing trans people and clinicians who kind of have shaped the history. The history is full of, villains and heroes and people who started out villains and turned into heroes and all kinds of kind of people in between. But as I started to read, I realized that every single patient visit was infused with this history, that this history impacted everything that was happening in my exam room, particularly the fact that although trans people have been described throughout the world and throughout history, medical interventions only date back to beginning of the 20th century. And most of the struggle that our patients face today have to do with the constant theme to legitimize care for transgender people and thus legitimize the lives of transgender people themselves. So every office visit was filled with barriers to care, problems accessing care. Beautiful things. Also, transitioning people are very, very wonderful to work with. Bearing witness to people's journeys is very, very rewarding. But also, I was always struck by how hard it was. And I came to understand through reading the history where that comes from. So patients have and continue to be labeled mentally ill, and that history goes way back to the late 1800s. And the clinicians who treat them are often considered suspect or quacks. So that's kind of where we're at, and the history is evolving. I just want to say that the talk, Who Speaks for Trans People, for me particularly as the cisgender member of this team, always gives me pause. It's an opportunity to consider this very important question, who speaks for trans people? I'm a white doctor, heterosexual, mother, married person, mother of 3. And do I have the right to speak for trans people or to this history? And I guess I think as an ally, as a professional, it's really important for me to speak when I need to, and also to shut up when I need to, and to know the difference. And sometimes I'm better at that than other times. Many of my patients feel very afraid, disempowered, are unable to speak for themselves, and are trying to access care in a system that is not designed to help them. And I do need to speak up in those situations as part of this historical journey to change what's happening in my community, in my hospital, in my ultrasound tech room, all these things. And also just to say that this history is not just the history of trans people, but it's the history of cisgender clinicians who have tried in various ways to meet the needs of transgender people, or pathologize them, or reject them. So my legacy is this mixed group of people who have done terrible harm, and some of them have done wonderful good. So that's where I come from. So the history book came from that, starting to write that paper. And then I was researching the paper and found online a talk that Dallas Denny had given on the history of surgical care for Fantasia Fair. And I read that talk, and I knew Dallas from Fantasia Fair and reached out to Dallas, and she said, oh, I'd love to do this. And then we kind of sat with it for a few years and worked on it a little bit. And then I attended this conference several years ago. I met and attended a talk by Kyan, who was also speaking to the history and how the history influenced his life and his professional world. So Kyan became part of the team, and later we were very, very privileged to be joined by Jamison Green, who brings a wealth of knowledge to our team. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dallas, who was next.
Hi, yes. My name is Dallas Denny. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I was personally affected by the state of transgender care. Growing up in the South, I had absolutely no sources for information to learn about ourselves. Myself, everything I knew, I just figured out. I had no literature. I knew no other trans people. It was frightening, and I was in my 20s before I started to come across information. I went to the Gender Identity Clinic. This was an old school clinic in the Hopkins model. in the late 70s, I went there and was essentially told I was not dysfunctional enough to be transsexual, and they weren't going to help me with hormones or surgery, at which point I forged a prescription for estrogen after spending 3 months in the medical library next door to the clinic, which no one has to do now. But I transitioned at age 39 after being on hormones for 10 years and immediately was drafted to run a support group. And within a year, I had launched a national nonprofit, and we were heavily involved. The name was American Educational Gender Information Service. It ran throughout the 90s. And we were heavily invested in working for respectful treatment from professionals, which was sort of rare in that time, and in getting rid of the mental illness label that we carried. All except for me, because I wasn't transsexual according to the clinic. So, I was warning about injected silicone and a very, very dangerous surgeon called John Ronald Brown from the early 90s. And so because of that background, I felt it was a good fit to be an editor for this book. And I did have some skin in the game because of my personal experience. So I'm very happy to be part of the team.
Jamison, you want to introduce yourself to round us out?
Sure. Jamison Green, he, him, his pronouns. I am on the West Coast. I am a writer and an editor and a manager of writers over the years in my professional career as manager of publications in corporations. I was a medical writer for a few years. I have done a lot in high tech. I transitioned on the job as an engineering group manager in charge of system software documentation at Sun Microsystems in 1988. It had taken me it had taken me 20 years to come up with language for myself, and then another almost 20 years to actually figure out that I could actually physically in real time transition. And it was, pretty much in isolation. I did meet a few people on the way, and then ultimately saw Steve Dane on television in 1976 or 77. Now I can't remember which, but he was the first modern day American trans man to get real publicity. And that was because he was a high school PE teacher who basically transitioned one summer between school years and came back expecting to keep his job and was not supported by the school board. And so he was fired. He filed a lawsuit and he immediately became famous. He became famous until Renee Richards transitioned and knocked Steve's story off the front page of the New York Times. He literally vanished, and Renee Richards was the only thing people ever talked about. Steve ultimately became a friend of mine. He was about 11 years older than I, and we had actually grown up in the same neighborhood, but didn't know each other. And I met him through Lou Sullivan, who many people will, if you're interested in trans history or know anything about transmasculine innovators, so to speak, Lou Sullivan is very much a hero in the trans male world. And so I learned about a lot of the barriers by recognizing that I had suddenly no access to my health insurance. And I also spent a lot of time helping Lou with his group. And when he died of complications of HIV in 1991, he asked me to take over his newsletter. And by sort of default, I ended up leading the group for the next 8.5 years. My interest in history is rooted in the fact that in order to get our rights, and because I come to this from a legal perspective as well as a technical medical perspective, in order to get our rights, we have to assert ourselves. And so learning how to do that communication, learning how to identify the issues, to find the power brokers who were able to influence the changes that we needed to have implemented in order to validate ourselves, in order to live our lives. Those were some of the problems that I looked at from my background in corporations and I actually taught legal writing at one point in the 70s as well. So I pretty much positioned myself at the intersection of law and medicine, joined the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, which is a whole nother long story I won't go into right now. But in order to influence the doctors who had already declared themselves as interested in treating us. And they were the ones who were setting policy. And they were the ones who were creating the standards. And I knew that we needed to change their attitudes. We needed to change their focus. And so I committed myself and worked with them for over 15 years to implement change there. And I'm very proud of what I was able to accomplish there. And it was painful as hell. It was very traumatic in many contexts, but I also worked on publishing. I published Becoming Invisible Man in 2004 through Vanderbilt University Press, and that was just reissued in 2020 in a revised second edition. And in there, I dumped a lot of knowledge, but not everything. And there's so much, and I've met so many people, so many of the significant players in the history of trans health and trans medicine, that I was just thrilled to be able to join this team and help to contribute and shape this book. So I'm glad to be here today. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think everyone in the audience can see why I'd be a little intimidated being part of this team. There have been multiple times where I've done research for part of the book, and then Dallas or Jamison will say, yeah, I knew that person, or we used to hang out, or I grew up next door to that person. So they really know the history in a way that I never will. And so it's been a privilege to work with them. So what we are going to do for the rest of the time that we have, trying to leave a little bit of flexibility towards the end, is just discuss some of the challenging questions that we've had to discuss as a team when we've started to write this book and edit this book. Because not everything has been super straightforward about how to approach writing every aspect of trans history, particularly trans medical history. And so we're going to go through some challenging questions that we've come across. I have written them and shuffled them in this deck so that our other panelists will be a little fresh. They won't know what's coming next, and so it won't be rehearsed. It'll just be sort of like a simulated group meeting of ours where we just have these conversations in real time. And we would invite you to jump in the chat if you have other things to add or other questions that come up. I want to just jump on something that Carolyn said and just say one challenging question that we won't discuss, just to get it out there, is whether white people should be telling trans history, and that's obviously not the case. And only white people, rather. So we are a team of white editors. It is something that we're very aware of. We have contributors who are able to cover the diversity of the trans experience. And so that's been something that we've been very invested in making sure that we're putting into place mechanisms to pay people to give us their experiences and to share their experiences, and finding alternative ways of recording their history through conversations and through oral histories. And so that's not a challenging question, it's an easy answer. We are not alone enough to be telling these stories. And I just wanted to say that out there, that is absolutely something we're aware of. And so even though we won't be discussing it further here, it's something that we are very cognizant of and is important to us. So with that being said, I'm going to throw the first question at the rest of the panel, which is, how do we know what pronouns to use? And specifically, this is referring to people who lived and died before our times, people who in various texts or in their own documentation of their own lives may have used different pronouns for themselves, people who lived at a time where pronouns weren't as well known as an important marker of gender identity as they are now. And so how do we know what to use? So Jamison, I'm going to throw it to you. If you can just sort of help us frame why this is actually more challenging than it might seem.
Well, I can recall the text by Diane Middlebrook about Billy Tipton, Suits Me, which was the authorized biography of Billy Tipton. And Diane Middlebrook, professor of English at Stanford University, and well-known biographer of actually, in particular, the poet Anne Sexton, but others as well. She was asked by Billy Tipton's wife to write his biography. And she at first resisted, but ultimately decided it was an interesting topic and did a tremendous amount of research. And her approach was problematic. And if there's a movie out now, a documentary out now called No Ordinary Man, which is a beautiful, beautiful film by Chase Joint and Ailing Chin, that that really describes a lot of those the problems that trans masculine community has with the way Billy Tipton is presented or has been presented by various people. Dr. Middlebrook made an editorial decision to use feminine pronouns in reference to Billy prior to the point in time when Billy transitioned and began living full-time as a man. And Billy himself did not identify as trans. He didn't have the language to identify as trans. He told some relatives, I think his two aunts, who he was still in contact with many years after he had started living as a man. They at one point asked him, "Are you a transsexual?" And he says, I'm not like those people. No, I'm not one of those people." So that I know from personal experience can be just a reaction, expressed transphobia, internalized transphobia, and it's just the denial that and the which signifies the pressure that trans people in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s were living with, because we didn't have language, we didn't have access to care, we didn't have anything for the most part. You had to be pretty wealthy or pretty well connected or pretty desperate to find something. And a lot of people weren't willing to go to the desperate place. And so they just muddled through. And that's, I think, the way Billy lived. So what do we do? Do we regard Billy as masculine all of the time for his entire existence? Or do we choose that path of, well, I think Dr. Middlebrook framed it as, let's be realistic. He was living as a woman. He was born a woman. He was living as a woman. So we should call him she at that time. And then when he transitions, we want to acknowledge that. So we call him he. But really, he was born a woman. So there is that she part of him. Some trans people actually do acknowledge that and do feel that way about their entire history. They will compartmentalize that in that way. And they will acknowledge the past that they had, and they may be proud of the past that they had. And that's, who are we to deny them that? Who are we to erase something that might have been important to them? And yet, who are we to deny them the identity that they strove so hard to actualize. So it's a real problem, and we've come up against that several times, talking about Christine Jorgensen, talking about Alan Hart, talking about a number of early trans people. And it's, as editors, we have to make an editorial decision. We don't write every piece in the book of the book. We are all contributing writers to the book in various chapters, but we have engaged lots of other people, like 25 or 30 people, to write portions of the book. And we've tried to be as inclusive and diverse as possible, and include as many voices as we can. And writing about this history is difficult, and not everybody knows a lot about it. And we're all digging, and we're all trying to discover, and it's really a challenge. I think that's all I have to say about it at this point. There's a lot to say about this. I'm sorry for going on.
Okay. Dallas, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I do. I think what Diane Middlebrook did has sort of caught on. A lot of times you do see biographies of people that refer to them by their birth pronouns until they transition and then switch. When we try that on for size, writing about Christine Jorgensen, it just did not feel right. I mean, Jorgensen was never a typical boy or a typical man. She was pretty aware from a young age, and she just seemed to work better. And we would be interested in feedback from the audience. I would also like to point out that language is, as Jamison did, that language is a movable feast, and especially language about trans people. It changes so fast that, you know, whatever we decide upon will be obsolete by the time the book is in print, more than likely. And all we can do is sort of use the latest in terminology at the time that we send the book to SUNY Press. And when these people were alive, many of them, the word transgender did not exist. The word transsexual did not exist for some of them. And, you know, how can we know what pronouns they would have preferred when they're dead and can't tell us, when their writings don't have the language to tell us? And that's a conundrum, and all we can do is make the best guess possible under the circumstances as editors, but it's very difficult.
Carolyn, I'll go to you. I'll just say that Andra in the chat says that approaching it with kindness and respect is the best thing. Someone quoting Julia Serrano calling it the language carousel, which actually, that escaped me. I hadn't heard that one. I like that one. Carolyn, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say I have had and continue to have the great privilege of working with a two-spirit trans advocate individual who wrote about the trans experience without that word, the two-spirit experience. And actually the word two-spirit is even a very new word in itself, but to describe the experience of gender diverse American Indian populations of many different tribes. And some of the languages didn't even have gendered pronouns. So we're trying to talk about 4 particular pioneers and really kind of struggling, like what pronoun do we use for this person whose language didn't even have he or she in it? So that one's a sticky wicket. There's another person, Polly Murray. If people don't know about Polly Murray, I just encourage you to read about Polly Murray. I am choosing to use she pronouns with her after doing a lot of thinking about it and talking about it with the team and reading other people's thoughts on Polly. Polly was an African-American civil rights icon. She refused to get in the back of the bus, I think 10 years before Rosa Parks, and no one really knew that. She was a lawyer and heavily influenced, in fact, wrote the argument that Thurgood Marshall later used in Brown versus the Board of Education, and also heavily influenced Reed versus Reed, Justice Ginsburg's case about discriminating on the basis of sex. So highly influential. Nobody hardly knows anything about Polly, which I hope is changing. But Polly probably today would identify as a trans person. Polly struggled with her gender throughout her life, and at a time when there were no words to describe her experience and no one offering care. But she never referred to herself with any other pronouns besides she or her. And her biography, she actually wrote her own autobiography and didn't mention anything about her gender struggles, which is very, very interesting. Her biographer found in her archives a lot of information and letters that she had written, looking for care, asking doctors to experiment on her, to try to help her masculinize. And at a certain point, she did kind of give that up and stopped doing that. But she was just a trailblazer in so many ways. But she didn't share that with anybody. So what do we do about that? You know, her biography shared it, but she didn't share it. Are we outing this person? Are we invading Polly's privacy by even writing about this struggle that she had? So thinking about that is, it's so
Yeah,
good.
and Polly herself talks about, in her autobiography, she talks about the fact that she's not comfortable with the term Black. She prefers Negro. Mm-hmm. She also obviously knew, she was close with, relatively sort of close with, as close as an average person can get, with Eleanor Roosevelt. She had a lot of access to power, but did not have power herself. But she had influence, and she was an amazing person. And she was also one of the founders of the National Organization for Women now. And she had a lot of access to lesbian culture, but she didn't go there in terms of her self-description. She was very, very private about her sexual and gender roles or identifications. So what are we supposed to do with that? And some people are starting to claim her as a trans man now. And that it concerns me. You know, I mean, I'd love to claim her as a trans man, but I have no evidence.
I think we have already gotten into there, so I'll go ahead and move on to the next question, which is largely what Jamison was just talking about. You know, my interest in this book, a lot of my interest is selfish, in the sense that I would really love to be able to connect with ancestors of mine who are not blood relatives, but who came before me and walked the trans experience and lived it and made my life better and easier and allowed me to have access to hormones, you know, that would not have been possible. And reading a lot of this history, I have to ask myself, is it appropriate for me to claim this person? You know, for me, like Dr. Alan Hart, is that someone I can claim as being trans, or was he cross-dressing because that was the only way that he could practice as a physician at the time in which he lived? And so that's been a question that I'm constantly asking. How do we know, before the time we had the term transgender, if someone would fit into our common conception today of what transgender is, and whether we should try to refrain from labeling people who lived prior to the experience, and what are the tensions there? So Dallas, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a conundrum. You know, you can come up with 5 different correct answers and they will still be incorrect in some ways. So I don't think as a community we've reached consensus on that, and all we can do is talk like this about it and hear what everyone has to say and make best guesses. And whatever we decide will be right, and whatever we decide will be wrong. But all we can do is our best.
Carolyn, do you want to maybe try to formulate an argument for why we would use a term like transgender for people who lived prior to that term? Putting you on the spot, but I promised I would, so. Carolyn, sorry, that was directed towards you. Did you?
Oh, that was to me? Oh,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I was answering a chat thing. Why would we refer to someone as transgender before the word was there? Well, I guess I think we do that with a lot of language, you know, things, we didn't have words to understand people's experience. And so we were very sloppy about describing people's experience. And as we have had more and more nuanced understanding of what this experience is and how to describe it, we have more specific terms that are more accurate and less pathologizing. Some people claim the term transsexual and like that term. Others find it very pathologizing and don't like it. So I guess that's my thought.
Jamison, I see your arm, so I feel like you're probably responding to questions in the chat too, but if I can try to pull you away from that for a moment.
Okay.
So Carolyn just gave a reason why we would sort of retroactively apply terms that we use now. What's the argument against that? Why would be doing that potentially wrong or wade into territory that we wouldn't want to wade into?
I think it could be presumptive. It could be shifting. It's like, if you ever watch Star Trek, you know, there's the prime directive. You don't interfere in the culture where you've just landed. And we don't know. We don't know who those people were. We don't know how they felt. But we like to imagine that, you know, it's like I imagine about Billy Tipton, if he met trans men and if he felt that there were other trans men like himself and felt that there were, and he didn't have to be so afraid. If he, you know, if he didn't have to be so closeted, that he might just start to identify with other people like himself. Doesn't mean he has to take on every aspect of another person's existence. It just means you're not alone. And I think that's that's the problems that we have. And I think Christine Jorgensen actually provides an interesting sort of transition. She was so famous and so many people wrote to her that, asking for help, asking for referrals, asking for, how can I do what you did, that she knew she wasn't alone. And so she took on a tremendous amount of responsibility and role in a way of modeling how a trans woman could be if one was Scandinavian ancestry, white in the United States in the 1950s. And, she was an incredible ambassador in many respects. Not everybody's prepared to do that sort of thing. And I think if you're gonna talk about how someone fits a mold, fits a model that is common today, but was not common with that person, you have to own that. You can't just assert it. You can't just say this is true about this person, because we don't have evidence. I think that you have to say this fits this person's behaviors, this person's expressed whatever fits a pattern. We don't know how they identified or if they would have identified in this way if they had access to the things we have now. But it fits a pattern, and it shows, and this person's life exemplifies for us now that we have always been around. We've existed before, that we are not new. And that, I think, is why it's important in a way, that why people want to claim people as ancestors. But I think you have to own it. I don't think you can just assert it and paste it on a person. You have to own that you don't know, but that you're a seeker.
Paul Miller in the chat wonders if using the umbrella term trans with an asterisk would be appropriate in these situations. And Dallas replied that one of our authors, Aaron DeVore, has decided to do that. He wrote about Reed Erickson, a very influential transgender man who really changed everything from 1960 to 80 for transgender people in the United States in so many different ways. And the terms at that time were transsexual and transvestite. And neither just really works for Reed Erickson. And so he has used just the term trans with an asterisk explaining what that's about. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, and then I think Dahlia in the chat said something that I think went along with what you were saying there, Jamison, sort of finding a pattern in, I don't know, the lowest common denominator. And I think this is what Leslie Feinberg does successfully in talking about trans warriors, thinking about not in terms of transgender, transsexual, or transvestite, but someone who is a gender transgressor, someone who was not adopting societal norms when it came to gender. And at least I can connect to that at the sort of lowest common denominator level and guess or think about what they might have done if they were born in my time when this language was accessible. Would you agree with that as something that you were playing with there?
Yeah, pretty much.
So someone asked a question in the chat also about people who later ancestors, descendants who read books about ancestors, or maybe read our book about one of their ancestors and are surprised that we're calling them trans or we're using these pronouns. And so I think this is a question that sort of relates to that. Like, is it ethical to out someone as trans if they weren't out in the time in which they lived? And not to make Jamison talk too much here, but I think you have a really illustrative example from the Billy Tipton movie experience that you had. Do you want to just start us with that?
Well, it's an interesting. Well, in the movie, I was privileged to meet Billy Tipton's son, and Billy Tipton's son had no idea that anyone had any connection to Billy Tipton at all. That there were other people like him. That other people lived sort of like he had lived, and he was completely blown away by meeting people who identified as transmasculine, and who knew who his father was. For all this time since 1991, after the splash on Oprah and all the other publicity that the Tipton family got after Billy died and was exposed we think the coroner was the one who leaked it to the press, that he had lived all this time until just when the movie crew showed up in late 2019. So all those years, he thought his dad didn't matter. Nobody cared. He was a freak. That's what people kept telling him. He loved his dad, and he didn't think he was a freak. He had a lot of respect for him. And he as a 19-year-old at the time of his father's death, held himself out in the media really, really well, expressing his appreciation for his father. And his recognition of his father as his father. And I think he was completely enlivened. I mean, enlivened. You could see him, kind of waking up to the fact that there were other people in the world like his dad. That was phenomenal.
Jamison. Carolyn, do you want to jump in on this? Because you mentioned this earlier a little bit. The idea of outing people who potentially weren't known to be gender transgressive at the time in which they lived.
Yeah, again, I'm just having some real interesting discussion in chat with Drasla's Dreamer, Shiela, who's talking about Indigenous people. And again, I'm just going to go back to this chapter by Trudy Jackson, who described people, who had it was a completely different culture. And, we call them Two-Spirit now, but there were different words and, 350 different tribes across the United States, with each with their own culture, and we take great presumption by claiming them and outing them, and yeah, it's an uncomfortable but also important step, I think.
Let me go back, because I personally think about this a lot when I'm planning presentations or any writing as a trans person. I think we are so weighed down by everything that is traumatizing about the trans lived experience. And I think right now we're in this wave of laws being passed. You can't help but check the news and see something else that is making it harder to live as an out trans person, harder to compete, harder to go to school, all of these things. And I worry that the non-trans community, the cisgender world who doesn't have access to the trans community, views us through this very sort of negative and traumatized and marginalized, minoritized, sort of victimized lens. But my experience of being within the community and my own experience of transition has been very joyful, and there's a lot of resilience within this community. So Dallas, how do you think about writing a book like ours about the history of trans medicine with all of the heaviness there, while still being able to balance some joy and resiliency?
I think we have to be very careful about respecting people's privacy, and that we don't need to out them. However, if someone is a public figure and it's just out there, I think exceptions can be made. It can also be very dangerous to be out. I just watched the film Paragraph 175, which happened to be on Turner Classic Movies this week. And you can see how a very brilliant LGBT scene in Berlin in the 1920s, by the 1930s, became gay people and gender variant people being rounded up and put in camps because the Nazis could identify them. So it's fraught with danger. But if someone is known, for instance, as an extreme example, Christine Jorgensen, just about everybody in the world knows that name, and I don't see a problem with discussing or having a bio in our book about Christine or other public figures.
Carolyn, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I guess, it's sort of the same thing comes up in the office. I see it's such a privilege to work with my transgender patients. And truly, I just feel like I'm bearing witness to this remarkable experience that people are having when they transition. It's a very beautiful, beautiful process to be part of. And I'm constantly struck by the joy and resilience of people that I work with, both professionally and these wonderful editors that I'm working with and friends that I work with. So there is a lot of joy, and I think it's so important to get that in there. But the pain is also astounding, and the experiences people have been forced to endure in our culture is just beyond belief sometimes. So to document that, to acknowledge it, to reference it, and keep it in parallel with the joy, I think is really important.
Yeah, Jamison, go ahead.
I really want to say that I agree with you that we have to, part of the major history of transgender medicine is the impact of transgender people on it. It hasn't all been done to us. A lot of people who are historical people and present day people have had amazing influence on how care is delivered, what care means, policies that have been developed, and we're telling the story of that as well in this book. We have to start in Europe and move it to the US, because trans medicine began in Western Europe, and then it moves to the United States, and then we basically have at it. And trans people didn't have much of a voice until the late 20th century, but there were a few influencers in the latter half of the 20th century, and very few, but some, and then there's been an explosion. And so we're documenting in many respects, and we can't, the press is limiting us to 500 double-spaced manuscript pages, so we can't cover everything. Sorry, Rebecca. But you know, we are doing the best we can to show this arc. Because some of the people in the beginning, as Carolyn said earlier, the cis people who were trying to help us were absolute champions. They were incredible heroes. They were amazing, and they took immense abuse for their interest in people like us. And they worked really hard, and they accomplished great things, and they vanished. And then people came in to try to, you know, the pendulum swung. People were nasty, people were critical, people were awful to us. And then the pendulum swung, and trans people started to get a voice. And, you know, here we are. We're trying to tell that whole story in as much detail as we can, given the limitations that we have to work within.
Thank you. I have 4 minutes left. So if there are questions in the chat, so I see an interesting one from Jade. Carolyn, do you maybe want to speak to this?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, Jade. So Jade mentions, I'm wondering how you take into effect the construction of trans identities by the West and how transness and even gender broadly are viewed differently pre-colonially. For example, the cultural role that the Hijra play. The Hijra are a group of transgender identified or gender diverse people in India. So we do have a whole chapter written on this topic. But many indigenous cultures, not just in the US, but across the world, had different ways of looking at gender that were completely not Western at all. And colonialization pretty much went through and standardized, I think, the approach of viewing gender diverse people as pathological. So there is a chapter speaking to that.
Any other questions from the chat or thoughts that we could speak to in the last couple of minutes we have here? I certainly open it to my co-editors if there's any last words you wanted to leave everyone with.
We do have a chapter by Serena Nanda in our book, who talks a lot about those alternative, she focuses on Eastern and Island and South America, gender identities and roles in probably a half dozen cultures in the book. So we're aware of that, and we do try to weave that into our discussions.
I put up on the screen just the web address for our book in case you're interested in learning more or want to get in touch with us. That's probably the easiest way to do it.
Well, I'll just add that I'm so excited about this book because there's so much misinformation. Not that we're giving clinical information. We aren't giving clinical information in this book. It's a history about, it's the history of how this field developed and who the people who impacted it. And, you know, now it's mushroomed into something much bigger than anybody 100 years ago ever thought it would. And so we're very proud of that. And I think we're all really excited about being able to dig into this and give our community and scholars a place to start from where this history is presented, and you can take any aspect of it and dig in and do more research on it, because we won't have enough pages to get it all in. But there's so much, and it's so exciting because the growth of our community has been phenomenal, and it's wonderful. So thanks.
If I might just, and one last thing, I saw earlier on someone made asked a question about how to raise the next generation of physicians to be more trans affirming, and that's something that I think each of us think about all the time. It's something that I do, you know, day in and day out in my role as a medical educator. And I think that for me personally, as a physician outside of my trans identity, not that I can ever extract one from the other, I think understanding the history of medicine is so important to understanding why we are where we are on any issue. And there's, we've come a very long way from the discovery of penicillin as an accident to the crazy antibiotics we have. And we also have a long history of a lot of terrible deeds towards a lot of different communities. And a lot of people had to work very hard to get us, to a better place. And we have to pick up that work and keep going. And so I think teaching trans history and trans medical history as part of medical school, or, for pre-med people who want to take an elective that's related to what they want to do, I think that itself could help raise up a generation of physicians to do better than we are now.
Carolyn, Dallas, Jamison, and Kai, thank you so much for an incredible session. I look forward, I hope to get an autographed copy of the book once I get my copy. Thank you, Rebecca, for convening, and thank you to the SUNY Press for being so supportive of the Spectrum Conference every year from day one. And especially thank you to everyone who has joined us. We are going to welcome Kai back in 30 minutes because Kai doesn't get to just do one session. We put him to work. So we are going to have a session on imagining technological solutions for transgender inclusion in higher ed, not to be missed. Folks, take the half hour, grab something to eat, check your email, check the Twitter or whatever it is that you do, and be back here.
Buy some books.
Buy some books, indeed. Read some books, buy some books, and be back here at 3 o'clock here on the East Coast, or whatever time it is where you are, for the next session, and we will see you then.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Again.